expert on China. And I want to tell you, David Iwinski is not an expert on China. And I'll explain who he is in a minute. I've written 2 books. One is in English and Chinese. It's called The Art of Investing in America. It was primarily written about 7 or 8 years ago for Chinese companies as they looked at doing business in the United States. The second book, Asia Ascending, was published 12, 18 months ago by a company in Chicago, a publisher. It talks about Asia, and it talks particularly about key China, Korea, Japan, and what's going on in Southeast Asia. I'm a boring guy. I sort of like to work, play with my grandchildren, and I like to write. So that's sort of my background. I'd like to tell you about David Iwinski. He's much more interesting than I am. David and I have known each other for 30 years. David originally, after graduating from the university and law school, he went into business, and he worked for Daimler-Benz. If you've been to the Frankfurt airport and been on the People Mover that connects the 4 terminals, if you've been to Rome, where the subway probably isn't running today because of the virus, David helped build that, and probably his most significant accomplishment was working with Daimler-Benz in Singapore. I think the greatest airport in the world is Singapore. The People Movers, David did that. After that, he moved on to work for a company called Respironics, which was later bought by Philips. What's interesting is David was then in the medical supply business. And it's sort of ironic that we're here with COVID-19 because his factory of 2,000 employees, which he built, that we'll talk more about in a few minutes, made surgical masks that were supplied throughout the United States. After that, David set up a company called Acusis, which was a medical transcription company. He's sort of a serial entrepreneur, and ended up with 1,800 employees in India doing medical transcription, and now has his own company. David lived in China for 6 years and ran a factory there. That's enough about us. I only did that to give you the background, is that we are not experts on China, although I've been there 65 times and David has lived there. Because if any of you on this call have been to China and you haven't been there for a year, it's a different China. China is not only changing by the year, it's changing by the week. And this presentation we'll be giving to you in the next few minutes, we've been working on for about 6 weeks. David will tell you more in just a second. And every day it changes. So that's where it is. So I'm going to turn it over to David, and let's begin the story. The beginning of the story is what's happened in China and why did it happen. The second part of the story is what does it mean to you? David.
Thanks, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be here, and we hope that you find this information useful, interesting and useful. Well, let's start with health crisis. This is something we all know about. We're not going to dwell on this at great length, but the stats as of today are 3.8 million cases, 2.2 active, and 266,076 deaths, and affecting about 210 countries. This is news that we hear probably to a point of overload. The only statistic I would like to comment on here is that these are understated numbers. They're understated because many of the countries don't possess adequate testing. Some of them have a mortality rate so high that probably some of the people get sick and die before they can even be counted or assessed. And some, unfortunate to say, dramatically underreport. Most egregiously of these is China. The notion that on the official global statistics that China has 1/10 of the cases and 1/10 of the deaths as compared to the United States is frankly ludicrous. And it's interesting because
if you accept that statistic, David, Turkey today, as far as COVID-19, than China ever had, which we don't believe.
Right. I mean, it's ridiculous. I heard today a commentator saying that, obviously the Chinese have a much better health system because they've managed to only have 1/10 the cases. This is just absurdity. So the reality is the health crisis itself is actually far worse than these statistics. And now there's a whole spate of articles talking about a second wave because people are so eager to go back to work and so eager to get on with things that we may be going back before we've kind of run the course of the first. Well, time will tell, and that's not why we're here. We want to start off this next point, a small segue to talk about these two factors, because if you don't know and understand these two factors, what happens next in China, which will ultimately be devastating to them, don't exactly make sense. Dennis, do you want to take the first one, or you prefer the second one?
Sure. Why don't I take the first one? When you think of a factory, you think of something down the road, you get in your car and you drive to it, you take public transportation, you work for 8 or 9 hours and you go home. The kind of factories we're talking about in China are totally different. David built a factory in Dongguan, which is not too far from Shenzhen, which is 60 miles from Hong Kong, when he was there living in China. It was a 5-story concrete erected building in which they made surgical masks. You would think that's the factory. No, that was part of the factory. Behind the factory, there was another building where you had a dormitory. This wasn't a Holiday Inn Express where you got your own room, but you would have 3 or 4 or 5 bunks stacked to the ceiling where people would sleep in shifts. Next, you'd have a building over here to your left or your right where they had a cafeteria because you had to feed the people. There might have been a small place in the back for healthcare because people do get sick. And then there was a soccer field, there was a basketball court, and people played. So when we talk about China factories here, they are really small villages or small towns. And these factories can be anywhere from 50 to 100 people to tens of thousands of people. And there are very large factories, for example, that assemble phones for Microsoft. Those factories can have tens of thousands of workers. But the key thing about these factories are they are in a small, constricted area. People are close when they work, they're close when they sleep, and they're close when they play and interact. And there are, if you go between Hong Kong and Shanghai, which is about 1,200 miles, and you get on a 10-lane road, you'll pass tens of thousands of these Chinese factories. And that model that I've just talked about in China is replicated elsewhere in the world. Dave, let's talk about what that means.
So you might be wondering, why can't they just go to work where they live? Why commute 1,200 miles? And why do they have to live in dorms? Well, the rich part of China is coastal China. It's where the factories are, it's where shipping is, it's where raw materials come in. But much of inner China and northern China do not have these lucrative enterprises. And that, however, is where most of the factory workers come from. So they commute. And it's odd. Sometimes they commute from other cities that have factories, but they may have a particular skill. But what that means is that once a year, everybody goes home. Chinese New Year or Spring Festival is a combination of, in America, Christmas, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, New Year's. It's every holiday we've got. And so everybody goes home. And when I ran my factory, we would normally have 3 to 7% of the factory workers stay back. And I could always count on every year 15% didn't come back. They were working because they made more money for me than they did back at home. They went home. They said, you know what, 5 years away from family, friends, and food, because China food is strongly regionalized. I've had enough. I'm not going back. So this was anticipated. However, the way to imagine this is imagine that in the United States over Christmas this year, everybody east of the Mississippi decides to go to Los Angeles. Everybody west decides to go to Boston. They stay for a week and then they go back. It's a migration that is staggering. I mean, literally staggering. And if you're there, it's just really amazing the number of people, hundreds and hundreds of millions of planes, buses, airplanes, car rides, train. It's enormous, but it happens. This year, for reasons that, in my opinion, had it happened a week earlier or a week late, it was that precise. The Chinese government, they knew about COVID, some say as early as October, November, certainly by December. They knew through January, and yet they waited until the very middle of Chinese New Year, when everybody had gone home. When if you were sick, you were going to carry that back with you. This gigantic migration, if they'd stopped it before, it actually would have been fantastic. if they'd stopped it after what we're going to describe wouldn't have happened, because people would have been quarantined inside their place of work. But they stopped it right in the middle. And that meant everybody went home, and then you had this quarantine. So in this quarantine, you had a lot of people that couldn't get home, or rather back to work. So this is just a small sample of the cities that were closed and locked up, and some of them to this day still locked up all the way into May. A friend of mine just last night from Hong Kong said they finally are letting some people get together in groups larger than 4. So this isn't some long distant problem. This is ongoing. But the big problem was they got locked away from work, and they don't have unemployment insurance. They don't have bailouts. Nobody's sending them $1,200 checks. They're locked out, and they need to eat. And so what do? They have to seek alternative employment. It may be at a lower rate than at the factory, but since they can't leave, and some of them, they could travel. They weren't in a quarantine city, but if your factory was in Wuhan, it was in Shenzhen or Guangzhou, well, you couldn't get in. It didn't make any difference. You had to go find an alternative place to work. And that led to this crisis. 780 million people under travel restrictions. They've got to find new jobs. Some of them might go back after the quarantines are lifted, but some of the quarantines are still on. So this created an enormous issue with employment. And as people staying at home, and again, I spend 3-4 hours a night on WeChat, Google, Skype video, Zoom video, talking to my clients and my friends and our team members in China. And this is the firsthand day-to-day information we get about what's happening. A whole lot of people now aren't in the factories that they used to live, work, and play in. And that's created a whole nother kind of problem. Dennis, why don't you take it from here?
As David said a few minutes ago, when he ran his factory, he would expect maybe 10 to 15% of the people not to come back at the end of the new year. We predict that between 40 and 60% of the workers throughout China were not able to get back to where they were working. For some, it was quarantine, as David said a few minutes ago. For others, I just don't want to go back. For others, for health reasons, they didn't do it. But so imagine having a factory. His factory used to have 2,000 workers. Let's assume that 1,000 are gone. You're faced with 2 big problems. Number one, where do you find another 1,000 workers when every one of the other hundreds of factories around you have found that about half of their workers haven't come back? That's a hiring crisis that's continuing to go on in China today. But assuming you can somehow find a worker to come in, let me put this in perspective. 30 years ago, when David and I were first going to China, the Chinese workers were working inexpensively, they weren't costly, and they weren't doing real sophisticated things. I have grandchildren who go to McDonald's. One was just here 10 minutes ago and just left, saying, when can we go to McDonald's to get a Happy Meal? Well, he doesn't want a Happy Meal. He likes the toy in the Happy Meal. It's sort of like some little piece of plastic that's some little character that he loves. And so in China 30 years ago, they used to take these pieces of plastic for a couple of cents and they go off to McDonald's and you buy them. Manufacturing in China today is extremely sophisticated. And so people are doing, whether they're making surgical masks or whether they're assembling iPhones or other things, it's a really critical time. So you just can't take somebody off the street and say, okay, put this together. So to put them on the lines, taking training. So basically you have a hiring problem. Where do I find them? Which they're really having great trouble doing in China now, which we'll demonstrate later. And how do you train them? And think about having a factory where you have orders that you have to fulfill. And remember one other thing. This comes right after the holiday. Everybody planned to be shut down for a week to 10 days, to most 2 weeks. But now you have something that's gone on for months. And so the orders that you had, that you needed a full coterie of workers to do, simply aren't there. David.
So you've got factories as far as the eye can see. You drive for 8 miles. They're all having this problem at the same time. They're all trying to find workers. They're all trying to train them. Sometimes the people that would normally train the workers didn't come back. So you've got to figure out how to train the trainers to train the staff. It's really a cascading catastrophe. But whatever you do get, whatever you drag off the street and bring in, the new ones aren't going to be fast enough and they aren't going to be as good. These aren't, as Dennis said, Happy Meal toys. These can be extremely sophisticated devices, medical devices, transit devices, phones, consumer electronics. You can't train them up in a half an hour. So they have to learn how to use the machines. They have to learn how to do quality control. So quality and output suffers dramatically. First, because there aren't enough people. Second, the ones that are there aren't trained. And even those that finally do it, they can't work as fast or as good. And so after some people start to go back, everything is just trending downhill. And again, we're talking to clients and friends alike. If I could only find people, and the ones I get aren't very good, but I still have to get some product out. I need to ship product. And the desperate need to ship product really gets us to this next issue. These factories are some of them.
Before we jump on that, before we jump in, that, just one thing as to quality. There's one kind of worker I've always admired, and that's a welder. A welder, he or she who is ever good, they're like an artist. They can do wonderful things. So imagine not having enough welders and trying to train somebody in China to be a welder overnight. It can't happen. And most of welding, as you know, it requires great precision. And oftentimes you have to x-ray the weld later to make sure that the weld is what it needs to be in conformance with the order. And so that's sort of my best example of how sophisticated China can and is, and the kind of problem they face. Go ahead, Dave. I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. So a lot of these companies are kind of hanging on by their fingernails. But now, because they can't ship product, when I was there, we would ship a lot of product to our customers before the shutdown. You're shut down for 2 weeks. You come back, you spin up the machines, you do a little test run to make sure it's all good. And then, man, you're making product. You want to get it in those cargo containers, on those ships, and on the way to America, because you need the revenue. Well, now they've been out 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks. Their productivity is way down. They're not getting paid. Companies are not placing orders. They can't ship, and they can't get the wire transfer once the shipping has occurred, because instead of 10 sea cargo boxes, they maybe got 1. And they also know when it gets there, it's not going to pass quality. They're probably going to have to rebate part of what they got paid or give credit. So they don't have access, though, to working capital. It's not as easy. In America, we take for granted that with a certain amount of order and backlog and a long history of good customers, you can get working capital, but they can't. And they really are not working with a lot of liquidity. Again, many of these factories, even very large ones, you'd be shocked to know how often they are going paycheck to paycheck, so to speak, with their end users. So all of these cascade, they create this kind of crisis, and then that leads to shortages of parts, finished goods, revenues are reduced, earnings are reduced. It even hits us because we saw the big hit our stock market took, because we couldn't get those parts. We couldn't receive those components, but we thought, well, in a little bit, it'll all pick back up. But these business effects of all these China activities, slowly but surely, it flowed over here. Now, at some point, some of you may still be thinking, interesting story, but okay.
How about one simple example?
Sure.
This is my iPhone 6. It was made in 2016. I use it because it works. But the important thing about the iPhone 6, it has 32 component box, not including the plastic, case that I bought to put it in. Those component parts come from 11 countries. 9 of them are made in China, but one of them's made in Taiwan. Another one comes from the UK. There's some from the US, and they're all over the world. The problem that companies will see and have not yet seen, but it's occurring right now, is when you lack one component part of 32, it doesn't work. David loves cars, by the way. He has a better example. He likes Lamborghinis. He said, let's say you're making a Lamborghini. We both wish we could afford one, but we can't. But he said, imagine having an entire Lamborghini, but from China, you have a plastic steering wheel that goes on the Lamborghini. You got that car with 12,000 separate parts. No steering wheel. You can't sell the Lamborghini. Go ahead, Dave.
Exactly. So all around, we're really feeling the pain, but there are still some people in the US and even maybe some in China who are thinking, well, it's going to get better. You know, it's going to ramp up. And the people here, I have to say, unless you know this history, and if you start with like how do Chinese factories work and why the timing of Chinese New Year was so abysmal for this quarantine, none of this other stuff really makes sense or doesn't happen quite as bad. They've been locked in the factories. They could have kept working, but they're hanging on over there and they're saying, you know what, but at least America is going to start buying stuff. And then the health crisis goes global. Just about the time they're desperate to get back, those of them that could work, we say, listen, we're not picking up our phones because we're sheltering at home. We're closed. Even essential businesses can only do so much. They can't ship because the shipping companies have more or less closed. And these days, if you want to get something on the air, forget it. That's booked up for the next 2 months for health equipment. Cost of a 747 in October was maybe $200,000. Now you're lucky to get one for 1.8 million. That's for one flight, Shanghai to San Francisco. So those companies that were just kind of hanging on by their fingernails, when we closed, we pushed them off a cliff. I mean, we pushed them off a cliff in a big way. And we predicted this February 6th on our company newsletter. This all seemed to Dennis and I just a whole series of dominoes that were going to fall, and we predicted it. And in amongst all of this, there's another part that factors into this. So while COVID kicked off this little sequence you're looking at now, well, there's more. And the more is, these are some trends, some of which are 3 years old, some of which are 30 years old, that have all been working, and for the most part, to China's detriment. You've got rising wages from when we first went over 35 years ago, you know, $10 a week to then 10 a day, and some places maybe 10 an hour. Debt crisis that is really out of control. Government loaning money to inefficient businesses. A housing bubble. Housing prices in China are astonishing. I mean, far beyond housing costs actually in the United States. Unemployment, not because of COVID, but long before COVID, there was automation, robotics, and things like shoes and dresses and clothes. That's gone. That's already gone to Vietnam. So there's an unemployment problem, but on top of that, an environmental crisis, the likes of which very few people here appreciate.
Dave, let's talk politics for a minute.
Sure.
David and I debate Donald Trump all the time. We are on opposite sides of Donald Trump. It doesn't matter who believes in what. But one thing is clear. The Trump tariffs had a tremendous impact upon Chinese companies. It drove many of these small companies that David said before have lack the ability to get financing, where they have very narrow capital. And so these companies that were working on narrow margins before have essentially been driven to the brink by these tariffs. And although the tariffs were readjusted, as you know, a bit with China in January, the damage had already been done. And so it wasn't just COVID-19, but as David said, it's the list of things that are in front of you now, plus the cost of the tariffs that essentially pushed the global supply chain over the cliff. Dave?
You've got all of this stuff going on, Southeast Asia competition rising, issues with the Spratlys and issues with Hong Kong and Tibet. And all of this was there all the way into January. And then COVID was just bam. So with all of these and all of those other things, we were predicting this on the 6th. We thought it would happen. We predicted what would happen. And it's already happening in a big way. April 2020, early on, there was a blogger that I follow, claimed he had information that 247,000 Chinese companies went bankrupt in January and February. I shared this statistic with a lot of people who said, that's impossible. That rate of bankruptcy is 6,400% of the US bankruptcy rate for the same period. We normally, every 2 months, have about 3,800 bankruptcies, 250,000. And they just questioned this blogger. But as we followed it, South China Morning Post shortly thereafter, and South China Morning Post is the Wall Street Journal of Hong Kong. It's the New York Times of China. They are reputable. They are independent. They said first quarter, 460,000 firms closed. 29% slower registration.
And you need to focus on the fact that many of these companies are in exactly the areas where we're talking about. They are supply chain companies of all various sizes. And if you look at, well, China's a big country, maybe that's not so bad. The registration of new firms earlier this year for the first 3 months fell by 29%. So it isn't like you had 500,000 firms go out of business and other ones. China really did it. And at the South China Morning Post, you can rely on, because it's not a Chinese government paper. It's one of the last real independent papers that exist in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong. Dave?
So what's this mean? Well, for America, it means that a lot of the finished goods that come to U.S. consumers, soon as the Walmarts and the Targets and the other folks run out of supply, they're not going to have any more. Interestingly enough, just today, Neiman Marcus declared bankruptcy. Today. Part of this may be that they haven't sold anything in a couple months, but part of it may be when they open up, they ain't going to have stuff to sell. So it doesn't actually matter if they open Texas tomorrow and all the other places where you have Neiman Marcus. If they haven't gotten supply and it's not coming in, it doesn't matter if you have consumers. Components for U.S. manufacturers, again, as Dennis said, you know, you got one of these great technological wonders, and maybe you make it right here in the United States, but if you don't have the critical part that's in an injection molded piece of plastic from China, you can't sell it. And particularly companies that have unique things. We also found out that as of April 20th, this was released by the China's National Bureau of Statistics. Normally they give this report in Mandarin and English. This one just came out in Chinese. And of course, I hate to say this, but it's a fact. If the National Bureau of Statistics said it, they understated it. It's actually worse than this. I mean, they probably bent every statistical rule to make this number look good. They basically said the economy, this is an economy that has grown 7 to 11% per year for 35 years. In one quarter, they're willing to admit 10%, 9.8. My guess, probably 15% or worse. So second quarter is going to be even worse as the impacts of this 500,000 companies. And again, as Dennis said, you know, I'm sure some of them were mom and pop restaurants and delivery services and quick prints, I'm sure. But you can guarantee that a lot of those 500,000, and by the way, that was first quarter, April, May, we get to the end of June, it'll be on the order of 700 to 800,000. By September, easily, I'd say 1 million companies gone.
One other
10,000 times our bankruptcy rate.
Let me add one other statistic to this. The U.S. economy in the first quarter, it was announced 3 days ago, contracted by about 4.6%. And we are trailing the Chinese by at least 2 to 3 months. So you look at this and you wonder what's coming here in the United States.
Yep.
Over the last 25 minutes, what David and I have done is tried to paint a picture for you of where we were and where we are now and how we got here. I'm sure you're very interested in the second part of our presentation is as to what you should do. But we didn't do it to depress you, but if we had given you a program saying, here are 3 recommendations, you'll say, oh yeah, that's fine, very interesting, I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to have a cup of coffee. But if you believe only half of what we're saying, we believe everything we're saying. You want to take half of what we're saying as to the severity of the crisis that's coming, you need to be concerned. So what we're going to do over the next 20 minutes or so, and then if you have questions, we'd love to answer your questions. We want to talk about 3 basic recommendations as to what you can do now and part of what you can expect to see happening over the next couple of months. Dave, you want to take point number 1?
Sure. Well, be pessimistic regarding forecasts of recovery. The nature of the governmental system, and this is not a political talk, but they have an inclination that they have to always share good news. I think this is interesting because, in America, when we have something happens politically, one side says, well, the other caused it, and the other side says, no, they caused it. And we fight back and forth about who caused the bad news, and everybody's got plenty of blame to go along. The only important thing, I think, for many of our politicians is that they get reelected. In China, they don't have that option. So when there's bad news, the government that announces it is universally held to be accountable for having caused those things. They can only blame America so many times and it wears thin. So they're always trying to be super optimistic about what they say. Current infection rates and mortality rates, they're much worse than are reported. There are large segments of the country still under quarantine, and quality and volume of production is going to stay low. Those 500,000 businesses, they aren't coming back anytime soon. Where would they get the capital to start them? How could they? So there's going to be, this is, in my opinion, going to be a permanent state of affairs for some number of years. And even the facilities that have opened, again, people that I know that I talk to at night, Dave, we can't get raw materials because the unique stuff we need, maybe we have 80% of it in the warehouse, but the shipping lanes have been closed for so long, everybody's dry. So we can't make the stuff even if we have the workforce. Inspection services are absolutely overwhelmed on health, protective personal gear that everybody's trying to get to the rest of the world. That's another thing. The Chinese recently seized the shipment of 23 million N95 masks. They said it was because they were worried that counterfeits would go to America. They were really worried about our welfare. Well, no, the reality is that'll be the first time that seizure has ever occurred. The reality is they need them for themselves, although they largely declare publicly that this COVID thing's kind of old news. But they need these masks because they've still got an ongoing crisis. So the first thing, be pessimistic. If you're sitting out there now with a business that depends on some stuff from China and you're thinking by June we'll be back to work full force, you better make sure yours wasn't one of those 500,000 companies already closed. And then here's the second point. Dennis?
We spoke before about cash. The problem that the Chinese companies have and will continue to have. And I think you all understand that. In the US, because of the way we are, I expect significant slowdowns in payments that companies will receive from the customers whom they serve. And I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. And so what your company needs to think about doing is, if you had 12 customers, but 3 or 4 of them were your most important customers that supplied you with 75 or 80% of the gross income that you have a year, you might want to look to those customers and to see and have meetings with them and decide, what could we do now to better service you? And if you had us, we all have customers who are sort of a pain in the neck. Okay, I'll supply you with something else. You might want to see which customers you need and want and which aren't as important, because you may not have enough products, as David said a few minutes ago, to ship out. And so I would think about an early on reallocation or reformation of how you're going to deal with the customers and who's most important. Secondly, let me give you an example. It might be true, but let's give you an example. Let's say you're a company in the business of making specialty alloys. You make them in your plant, you then machine them, sometimes for military and non-military uses. I actually know of a company like this. That company may have a relatively short ability to get the components, the stock that it needs to make its alloys. You all know about metals, you know, the specialty metals that Chinese essentially control. I think you need to go out as quickly as you can and try to find additional inventory wherever you can if you're in this kind of business, because 2 or 3 months from now, I think that the supply chain will, in a lot of places, have grown so short in the rare metals area, as an example, where you need to have those things. The other thing is if you pay your vendors net 30, net 45, whatever your terms are, you might want to look at that. Not to say you don't pay people. You do need to pay them, but you need to think about, how do I conserve my cash over the next 60 to 90 days to see where I am? And so this sounds logical. You can say, of course, we always conserve our cash. But I think any extraneous spending on things such as unnecessary travel, you know, the sponsorships that you have for things, I would hunker down really strongly now, because as the global supply chain grows, the ability to get capital on a reliable, predictable basis is going to become more difficult. Dave.
And this is what we really think is the most important thing. You know, the first two recommendations are kind of, you know, to be honest, somewhat short term. You know, be a little pessimistic about what you hear and save your cash. Not bad advice at any time, I guess I would say. But the thing that needs to be thought about when you're still sheltering and maybe you're not an essential business and you're thinking of reopening, realign or reshore, and think about doing it right now. It's not going to happen in an afternoon, but this should not wait for reasons that we will explain. The realignment, if you're in China, doesn't mean, you know, obviously a million factories closing doesn't mean they're all closed. But if you're in one factory, at the very least, diversify north and south. This is, again, good practice. And I will say, you know, just have a tiny segue here. You know, for the last 30, 35 years, primarily following the lead initially of General Electric under the leadership of Jack Welch, and then following some of the examples of some of the Japanese companies, Toyota, Sony, Honda in particular, we've been really on an aggressive kick about leaning out. Super small supply chains, drive every dime out, just in time, everything. You know, if you get a box of pens, don't get two, get one. The day you finish your last pen, another box will show up. And this has been great for the accounting side, because it pushes all those transactions out, it pushes the spend out, it reduces cost of capital, it reduces the work in progress. And this has been very valued. So we've been doing it, except it made us so lean and so narrow that one factory has a fire. If that's the only one that you get your parts from, you're stopped. So diversify within China if you're still there. Consider strongly migrating some of your production to India, Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia, Laos. We've taken several clients to almost all of these countries over the last 2 years because of risk assessment, that having everything in the China basket, and with all those other trends, it wasn't the cheapest anymore, and there were still issues. And as the political battling continues, maybe you didn't want to have everything there. But we think Latin America, Mexico, some other countries will also be places to go. So if you haven't taken a really serious look, you need to do that, and do it soon. See where your risk, and the risk may not be in the big things. It may be some very small part. The things that are sole sourced, that's an area of big risk. Aside from realignment, however, the other recommendation, and Dennis, you can start this one, reshoring.
Thanks, David. If there's any good news coming out of the coronavirus, and I know we're all looking for it, I honestly think the good news is that American companies are going to recognize the importance of reshoring some, but not necessarily all, of the products that they get from overseas. It isn't that we're being loyal Americans. It's simply good business. A lot of companies, particularly public companies, have been driven for the last 30 years. Okay, what profit am I going to make this quarter? Okay, what am I going to do the next 6 months, and where am I going to be at the end of the year? Which is one of the reasons why supply chain, just-in-time manufacturing was great. But I don't think that drive that David mentioned, a lot of it, I think, attributable to Jack Welch 30 years ago, is going to continue. I see a growing nationalism around the world, and I do think that our Congress, this is a prediction, I can be wrong, I don't know, but I think our Congress will be passing laws in the next year or two saying, here's a tax benefit, or here's a reason why it might make sense to manufacture your products in America. The other thing that we haven't mentioned a lot is a lot of manufacturing is different today than it used to be. When we now have 3D manufacturing. If I'm holding up a pen here, it used to be if I wanted to make this pen, assuming it was valuable, I had to make 10,000 of them in order to make them and sell them. Now with 3D manufacturing, and a lot of it goes to the specialty parts that David was talking about here, you can really do those with 3D manufacturing. And so I think that the US in the next 4 to 5 years, if we're smart, I hope we're smart, hope to God we're smart, that we'll be able to take advantage of this thing, because the transportation problems that David pointed out are significant. We're trying to shift something from Shanghai to essentially the West Coast. We thought it would be $200,000. It was $1.8 million to put it on an airliner. When things are closer, they're better. I think Mexico is going to be one of the really big winners when you look at the reshoring, if not in the US, close to the United States. And so the two recommendations we're making is, one, build internal capacity if you can, look at your supply chain, and then look for domestic alternatives. Now, I bet there's somebody on this call today is saying, I got no problem. I get all my stuff from the United States now, so this is an interesting seminar, but I'm not going to pay attention. Do you know if each one of your suppliers gets all of the contents of whatever it is you get from them domestically, or do they have a control over it? I'll bet you that you have suppliers you don't know about who are, quote, US suppliers, but are getting a lot of this stuff from overseas. That's when this tidal wave of the problems that we're seeing today in supply chain manufacturing are really going to come home to roost. David?
Well, absolutely. And it's not just that. Let's say that all of your suppliers are safe and sound, and you feel you're safe and sound. But if you sell a subcomponent to someone and one of your largest customers is relying upon a piece from China and they can't get it, which means they're not moving volume, their orders to you are going to close down. But as Dennis said, the good news is, there's an old saying that I heard was prevalent at the time of the US Great Depression. When there's blood in the streets, there's gold to be picked up. So hopefully many of you in this call are looking at this and saying, I've been fighting tough China competition for a long time, and this is an opportunity for me to demonstrate the fullness of my capabilities and my skills. Robotics can help. American labor efficiency has always been higher. Cost of transport, all of these things, and I do think Dennis is right. Nationalism is not so much in the negative term, but in the sense of self-reliance, I think, is on the rise, and not just in the United States. I mean, obviously, it emerged strongly over the last presidential cycle, but at the same time that was happening, so was Brexit, and UK decided, look, enough of throwing our lot in with anybody and everybody that's in the entire EU. We want to chart our own course. I've talked to lots of CEOs in the med device world over the past 2 months. A phrase that virtually every one of them has said: how did we let this happen? Most of these ventilators, that our lack of ventilators and respirators are causing people to die here, we invented. It's our technology, it's our patents, but we let the production shift offshore. So we need to pull this back. And as Dennis said, it may be from a tax incentive, and I don't think it'll be 2 years. In fact, 2 days ago, a friend of mine who runs a company that makes power transmission equipment called me to say a new executive order went out. No longer will federal money be permitted to be used to buy transformers for power grid that are made from what is called a foreign adversary. And I said, what's a foreign adversary? He said, China. Siemens, stuff from Germany, ABB, we'll buy that, but you can't spend Fed money on a China-made or a China-owned company. So I think that that legislative process, starting with executive order, moving then later legislation, it's already in play. So some of you on this call, this is an opportunity. Get there quick. And, you know, in the realign or reshore now, the most important word is the now. Because here's the other problem. If you say, well, this is a very interesting topic, and I'll be really curious to see how that works out for my company, because I do get a 25% of my supplies from China. By the time it becomes obvious to everyone, it's obvious to everyone. So if you have a piece of plastic that needs a 48 cavity mold, maybe you need a family of 8 of those molds, like I used to have in my factory in China, and those 40-foot C boxes don't show up in Los Angeles, and you call over and the phone keeps on ringing and ringing and ringing, you say, oh my goodness, I've got a problem. Go down to a local machine shop and say, listen, I need a 48 cavity mold. In fact, I need 10 of them. And they say, well, great, we got enough CNC machines. It's going to take 6 to 8 weeks to cut that. We'll slot you in for March of 2022. Because it's you and about 15 to 20 to 50,000 other American companies all at the same time, finding out that in that 500,000 and soon to be 1 million closures, some of their molds are sitting over there on the floor in China getting rusty right now. There's a padlock on the fence outside that factory. And so we feel like someone like Paul Revere. We're trying to say, we saw this in February, we predicted it, it didn't get much attention at all. To this day, you have to look hard to find this information in mainstream media. They're just not telling this story. I don't know why. They should. It's a phenomenal story. But the reality is these closures are going to hit us, and they're going to hit us hard. And if we all wait till it's obvious, then all of your competitors are going to be trying to solve this problem at the very same time. The countries we suggest in Southeast Asia, they can't absorb the capacity of all 1 million of these closures. Neither can we right now. So I do think we're going to have a really tumultuous next 3 to 5 years. It's going to be interesting. Going to be some folks that just are passive and are going to get hurt by it, unfortunately. There are going to be some that are going to be aggressive and a little bit risk oriented and are going to grow their businesses tremendously during this period. So for some of you, it's time to hunker down and try to survive. For some of you, it's time to get aggressive, ramp up marketing, ramp up your capabilities, and get ready to take advantage of all this work that is not going to be done in China.
Let me add one more thing. Oh, go ahead, David. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say time is of the essence. Capacity is not unlimited. Start with an assessment of your risk, and try to figure out where your pain points are, and take some action. I don't think you'll find it wasted time. Dennis?
Before we go to questions, let me just add one more point. The other good news, I know you're looking for the good news again, is that the American economy will traditionally be the driving economy in the world. I think it will continue to be so in the future, even if we go into a deep recession. And so because of the political issues I mentioned a few minutes ago, and because of the shortages that David talked about, the American economy and we as a country and as companies will be more attractive to these companies overseas, either to the Chinese companies that are no longer necessarily, maybe not be able to sell here, but to people who want to have operations here. So I think you're going to find foreign buyers of your companies or investors or joint venture partners more interested looking in the future and looking to work with you now than they were in the past. And so be aggressive and go out looking for these opportunities. Lori and Elizabeth, we've taken about 15 minutes. We've covered, I think, the major points. We can go on, or if there are any questions.
There's a question, Dennis.
Go ahead, please.
We did get one question that came in, and someone was asking, about the cost of total ownership and narrowing the gap for U.S. manufacturing. I think that, in my opinion, and Dennis, you may have a different point of view, you know, the pendulum swung so far to the China side that really a lot of what we weren't factoring in was risk. And I'll tell you something really interesting. A little saying that my mom taught me years ago. She was a nuclear engineer, worked Westinghouse for 44 years. We could do a whole seminar on nuclear, but she used to say, money wakes up first. So a lot of the private equity venture capitalists that were pushing for super lean, and if you want an investment, if you wanted money, one thing they'd say is, where's your EBITDA? Have you squeezed every penny? Have you outsourced everything? Have you shoved it all overseas? I'm told by some of our team members, and we've got a couple of folks on the Blue Water team who, you know, ex-CEOs of multi-billion-dollar publicly traded companies, some very, very, very well-known people. They tell me that over the past month and a half, in talking to folks in New York and Wall Street, the finance side, that pendulum is already swinging back hard. And what they're saying now is, when they look to give out money, when they look to invest, have you de-risked your supply chain? Have you de-risked it? Because they've now realized, as much as they love that big EBITDA number, if that EBITDA number is based on this tiny, tenuous string of everything having to go right, one boat can't go down, one factory can't catch fire, COVID can't happen. Actually, it's a far riskier investment despite the apparent financial return. And that if you spend more by diversifying, you then get a situation where the risk to the investor is much greater if you're too lean. So money wakes up first, and they're already waking up to this. So I do think that the calculations about what's important actually is going to shift. Dennis, any comment you wanted to make on that?
One question I've commonly had when we've been talking about this is, people said to me, is this like a temporary phenomenon? Are we going to see things going back to where they are? My answer is no. I think things have changed permanently, and the realignment that you're going to see in the supply chain isn't just whether it's going to happen or temporarily it's going to happen. It is going to happen, and I think the companies that take advantage of it now will be in the best position to go forward on it. And I'd like to say, let's go back to normal. What did things used to be? I'm not sure what the future does, but this is a change. One other issue, or one story I might tell, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember, but between 1986 and 1992, what was the #1 most dominant country in the world that was going to take over the world? It wasn't China, it was Japan. At that time, 7 of the 10 largest banks in the world were the largest banks in the world. The largest bank in the world was something called Daiichi Kangyo, which most people on this call have never even heard of. Well, Japan went through this great growth, as China has. It hit the roof, and since then, the Chinese stock market went from 30,000 down to where essentially it is today, which isn't anywhere near 30,000. That sort of ended. Japan is going to rule the world. China's been on a great upward path. It's a great country, and they work hard. But I do think that they've hit a wall, and I think their credibility is now peaking. And I think the opportunity for companies to see the future, we can have a great next century or decades coming from America, if in fact we take advantage of it. Elizabeth and Lori, you've been very kind to invite us to be here today. We've had a great time. We hope your people on the call have learned or enjoyed something.
Oh, absolutely. There was actually one other question from Yunlin Chen, and she was curious to know from what perspective the labor efficiency in the United States is higher than overseas manufacturing companies.
I'll give an answer to that from my perspective, and Dennis, you may have as well. We've actually seen for some time, I don't know when my screen just went dark here. But for some time, we've actually seen in other companies that we've worked with that are reshoring and that's been a trend that's been slowly accelerating since some of the tariffs went into play, is that the number per hour of output, particularly in semi-automated operations or where you had more sophisticated multi-station operations, that the American side was still had a slight productivity gain versus many of the China factories. And these are places that I work in as well as people we advise now. They tend to have more people doing fewer operations, that is less versatility up and down the production line. This is actually a trend that's been going on in the United States for quite some time, is to have one person that can handle 2 or 3 stations upwards and downwards so they can do a quick shift. That flexibility has typically been a higher benefit on the American side versus more traditional China operations, more people, but doing smaller numbers of things. And Dennis, another question came up that I think you may want to answer. How will this affect the Belt and Road Initiative globally?
Whoever asked the question, I think it's a great question. China essentially has said between now and a sort of 2040, 2045 or 2050, they're going to spend $1 trillion to essentially make the road that exists between China and essentially what is Europe, what we know of as Europe and the European Union, open. So instead of putting products on a ship in Shanghai and shipping it down around Africa or through the canal, you're simply going to be able to put it on a road and get into Europe. I think that China has lost a lot of its credibility over the last 3 or 4 months because of what's going on here. The Belt and Road Initiative has China has essentially gone to countries and said, look, I will lend you all of this money, but I want security in your ports and other things if you're not able to pay back. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is not going to disappear, but I think it's going to slow down. And if a country's going to ask itself, do I think my future for all of the manufactured products that I want should essentially be sourced in China? I think the answer to that is probably not. But thank you for a very good question.
And I'd like to just add one other overview comment. You know, Dennis and I have been traveling and working in China. Dennis, of course, is all over the world, and I've done a lot of time in India and Europe as well. But China has been the predominant place since the day I left law school that I've been working. We're not here. I mean, there are lots of folks that I've been hearing for decades just do China bashing. That's not it at all. We're not here to be critical. We're just pointing out inexorable trends based on the data that we see. And the reality is, when we did make our prediction back in February, we did get accused of being, you know, China bashing and overly negative. But the reality has actually turned out worse than even we imagined. And I suspect that those numbers are still very understated. The point here is, it's not a matter of an ideological issue or a political issue. This isn't that kind of conversation. It's about grappling with the reality of what's actually happening there and how that will actually affect people here. And the more information they have, the more transparent the situation is, the better the decisions people can make about their livelihoods. We don't want anyone to walk away from this call and later run into some hot water and say, gosh, I wish I'd known that was going to happen. If you're reliant on some core China resources that may not be in business anymore, you now, I think, have a duty to look into that factually. A lot of companies are still going to be there, don't get me wrong, and perhaps none of your suppliers are included in those that are going under. You'll still have to wrestle with issues with tariffs and all the other problems that they've got to wrestle with over there, and we have our own problems here. But this is really not so much about whether one system is good or bad, but what's actually happening on the ground right now, which, in my opinion, is a vastly unreported story. These kinds of numbers, we've had to ferret out from other sources and international sources. South China Morning Post, very reputable. But other than that, these aren't yet big headlines in the United States, and they should be, because they affect us.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions?
Yeah, you can type them or just unmute your mic and just say it out loud.
I'll make sure everybody's unmuted.
Can we get a copy of the presentation material?
Yes,
Absolutely.
we would be glad to do that. I also have a 6-page outline of steps from a legal standpoint that companies really should think about in looking at their supply chain contracts. I'll be glad to forward it on to Elizabeth or Lori or both of them. And then if you have an interest, I'm sure they'd be glad to send it along to you.
Good.
I'll also add that the South China Post, which is the news source that both of these gentlemen have mentioned, has a really good website. And so if this is an area of interest and import to you, I would strongly advise, add it to one of the things you check every once in a while. Because it's an independent source, and it's not going to be giving whatever China needs you to hear or wants you to hear, I guess is a better way to put it.
So Elizabeth, will you be emailing us the information?
You're muted. Yes. I'll make
Sorry about that.
slides and she can get them out to you by email. And Elizabeth, I'll send you a PDF copy so it'll be easy to send.
Okay. And I have all of your email addresses. I promise I'm not going to start spamming you with stuff all the time, but if we get information about this, I will be sending it on to you. So, it'll come from Link to Visibility via MailChimp. So, make sure that I'm not in your spam folder.
Oh, Elizabeth and Lori, thank you very much for bringing David and Dennis to this event and letting them share their experience and history with us.
You're welcome. I thought it was important, recognizing I'm part of the supply chain. I feel this was an important thing for all of you to start thinking about and what it's going to do to business going forward.
Yeah, and the manufacturers that I've been talking about have always been, I want to build up my business, and I want to see about reshoring and getting, the business back that I've lost in China. And so this is something that, you can talk about, and you can present it in your different, ways you're marketing, and not be China bashing, but you can talk about the value, locally sourcing and supporting your communities. So, it's both helpful for you as you run your business, but also helpful as you promote your business. And I thought, wow, it's so nice to get information that's not coming from, one of the news sources, and, which angle is it coming from? And it's, when I missed it, I was really grateful that, when I called up David, he was like, yeah, not only that will I give you slides, but let's do it as a webinar. So I thought, I think I know some people who might be interested, and I've certainly learned something. And so I'd just like to say thank you guys so much for being willing to do this and taking the time. And thank you all for taking time out of your day, locking your doors so your kids can't break into your offices, or whatever it is. Yeah, I had somebody knock on my door during the meeting, and I just ignored it. But thank everybody for your time and your willingness to meet. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to Lori and I, and we will keep the information flowing.
Very much.
Thanks again for your webinar, and appreciated it.
Thanks, everybody.
Good.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thanks for your time.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.